expect yourself to be perfect right off the bat. That's me. Hi. Hello, beautiful friends and fellow word lovers. Welcome back to Pocket of Poetry, to the late night show with Olivia. Just kidding. I'm filming this at like 8 p.m. So we're back to the vibey lighting. That's what I'm gonna start calling it. So the late night show. That's what it is. Welcome back to the channel. I hope you guys are all having a lovely day or night wherever you may be. Today's video is going to be part 2 of my tips from a first-time author series. And if you have not seen part 1, you should click the link in my description right now. Basically, in this series, I just talk about my experiences and my tips from those experiences with writing my first book, which by the way is sitting right here, Light My Sky. You can also purchase it in the description below. But as a first-time author, I just have had a few different things that I felt like might be helpful to share with other people who are wanting to write their very first book. So in part 1, I talked a lot about writing the first draft. So I shared this quote that says, writing the first draft is for making it exist. The second draft is about making it functional, and the third draft is for making it effective. So in the last video, I talked about making it exist and making it functional. So kind of both went hand in hand a little bit in that video. So I just talked about like basically writing your initial draft. And in this video, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about making your story effective. So AKA the editing / revision portion of the process. And I'm just going to be sharing a few tips that I have found helpful during my editing and revising experiences. Again, disclaimer, I'm obviously not an expert. I've published 1 book. Everything that I say with a grain of salt. Like, I know everybody is different. Everybody does things differently. This is just what's worked for me, so I hope that it can maybe help someone. Tip number 1 that I have when it comes to revising your novel, and this is after you've, written the entire story, you're done with it, you've made whatever initial changes, whatever easy fixes. Maybe some people have suggested a few things to you and you've made those adjustments, but for the most part, you want to get it publishing ready, but you aren't quite sure what steps to take to get there yet. So I actually have a few tips here. My first tip for editing and revising your first draft is to take a break. Like, honestly, I don't think there is a single thing that helped me with editing more than just taking a break from my manuscript, not looking at it, not even thinking about it for a while. And obviously how long your break is going to depend on you and your story. For me, it was several months between when I finished my initial draft and when I went to seriously start editing it. In fact, it was almost a year. It doesn't have to be that long, but I think if you take a break and take a step back and just kind of put it on the back burner for a while, when you come back to your story, your mind is so much more fresh and clear. You're no longer in that muddled author mode where you're like, oh my gosh, I hate my entire book and I hate everything I've ever written. Like, sometimes it just takes taking a step back, because for me, so many times I've gotten to that point with a story or a project where I just absolutely hate it. And you just have to give yourself a break sometimes. You just have to give yourself space from it. Hard thing to do sometimes, because you want to just get it done and you want to just get it out there, but I promise you it's gonna help so much. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've gone back to a project and been like, oh, this is actually pretty good, when like months earlier I had like detested it. So you just need that space and time sometimes. And it helps so much when you are in the middle of things and you've just written something and it's your baby and you just birthed it and you don't know what to do with it. Sometimes you just have no idea what it needs. Like, it needs something and it needs change, but you just don't know what that is yet. And it takes time. Sometimes it takes time away. And then when you come back, you have a clear mind, fresh slate, and you are like, oh, like, that's what happened to me. When I went back to it after almost a year of not working on Light My Sky, I instantly saw like 50 things that I knew I could fix and change. Like, it was so quick. Like, it was so easy to just identify those things. So that is my first tip. Take a break. Don't be afraid to take time off and give yourself some space from what you're working on. So tip number 2, if you're anything like me, you are super self-critical of your writing and you overanalyze everything about it, and you just, expect yourself to be perfect right off the bat. That's me. Hi. But yeah, if you're anything like me, you probably relate to that a little bit. Just that feeling of like, oh, it sucks. It's awful. I hate it. Something is wrong with it. Or just knowing that there's a big piece of the puzzle missing, or there's something that it needs that it's not getting, and not knowing what that is. So my second tip for you is to brainstorm, sit down, write down a list of everything about your novel that bothers you. Everything, even if it's just something tiny and minuscule, just write it down and think about what the problem is. Think about why it's a problem, because sometimes it's not a problem, honestly. Like sometimes there are things that are so small and minuscule, and we as writers get so picky and nitpicky over things, and we don't need to be. Sometimes it's really not that necessary. Sometimes you need to bounce it off someone else to figure out what is and isn't necessary to change. Sometimes you might write it down and then think, oh, I don't need to change that, or yeah, I definitely need to change that. So you just kind of, seeing it on paper helps a lot, helps you to kind of identify that, and identify why you might want to be making that change, or what the purpose of that change might be. After that, once you have identified what those changes are and what those problems are, your next step is to write down your solution. So for example, one of the problems that I had with Light My Sky when I actually went to edit my first draft, it's a historical novel. It's set in the 1960s. And one of the things that really bothered me about this book was the fact that it didn't have enough historical references. I hadn't referenced the time period enough. I hadn't made it atmospheric enough to the 60s. And so that was one of my big things. And that was one of the biggest problems and roadblocks that I ran into when I was going to edit, because I was like, I don't know what to add. I don't know what needs to be added where, what's too much, what's not. And after I took my break and came back, I just wrote down some places or some ideas of ways that I could incorporate the 1960s. So things like cars, music, movies, pop culture references, things like that really helped me to create more of an atmosphere that lends itself to an older time period. So I just wrote down like kind of a list of ideas of things that I could include. And then as I was going through my story from beginning to end again, I would just write down places where I felt that I could insert those things, and then I would put those things in. So that's just an example, but if maybe you feel like you want more character development for a certain character, write down things that you want to include and then put in places where you will include those things. Or if you want like more banter or more establishment of a relationship between certain characters, write out what places can I include this, and then include it. So that's my second tip. Start with your problems, start with your questions, start with what is wrong, and brainstorm solutions to those things. And you don't have to put all the solutions in right away, but if you have a general idea of what kinds of solutions you want to include, like my example with the time period, they'll come to you as you're going through your manuscript, and they'll kind of pop out to you. So that brings me to my third tip, which is obviously to go through your manuscript from beginning to end. At least for me, that's the way that I find it works best, because you're going through it linearly. You're going through it as your reader is going to go through it, and you're going from beginning to end. And so when I do that, so this is the tip here, when I go through from beginning to end, my biggest and most helpful tip that I cannot emphasize enough is to read your manuscript out loud. I'm sure you may have heard this tip before, but it helps monumentally when you are editing. And especially for someone like me who is super, super picky about sentence structure and flow, reading it out loud is going to help you hear it. And when you can hear it out loud, it is just like, it alerts you to so many problems that you don't notice when you're reading silently. Like, it just gives you such an additional layer of insight into your story, because when you can hear those words out loud, it provides, okay, yeah, this sentence sounds a little funky. Okay, this doesn't really make sense. Oh, I made a mistake here. Like, it's so much easier to recognize mistakes and problems when you're reading things out loud. So that is my probably biggest tip, maybe second only to the taking a break one, but that one is really, really important. I think so many authors could benefit from this. Like, I have read so many books where I'm like, hey, if you had just taken the time, like, even if you don't have this is again, self-editing. So if you don't have an editor, if you had just taken the time to go through and read your book out loud, I guarantee you there would be half as many typos, half as many mistakes, half as many weirdly worded sentences. Like, it would just be so much better. So that is my next tip. And really, truly, if you take nothing else away, take that away, because I genuinely think it helps so, so much with editing and revision and making your book the best that it can be. I have just one more tip. It kind of goes hand in hand with the problem solution one that I talked about before, but this is more about incorporating your solutions. So when you go in, identify what your book needs more of, because every manuscript is going to have something that it needs more of. Every manuscript is going to have parts that you don't love. When you come across those parts that you don't love, identify why it is that you don't like them. For me, I had a lot of scenes in my initial rough draft that bored me to death. Like, I was falling asleep reading them. That's not good. So I identified, okay, why is this scene boring? A lot of the times it was because I didn't have very interesting dialogue between the characters. And I was like, okay, these characters are kind of boring. Their dialogue isn't very interesting. So I added spice. I added more dialogue. That a lot of the times fixes a boring scene, especially if it's a scene where there's dialogue between two characters. Add more banter, add more funny things. I mean, if it's appropriate to the story, obviously, but that's what I did with mine. Like, I added a lot more banter between certain characters. I added a lot more, I guess, character development in a way. Like, my main character, Eleanor, has a best friend character named Nancy. And one of the things that bothered me about my initial draft was that Nancy just did not have enough character development. I didn't like, she fell a little bit flat for me. And so I tried adding some extra, fun, bantery, witty dialogue between Eleanor and Nancy to kind of explain their relationship a little bit, and also to endear Nancy to the readers a little bit more. So that was one thing that I did, just added a lot of dialogue to make scenes more interesting. Some scenes might just not quite work, be super boring. Another tip that I have is, if you find that you're really, really bored by a scene, try changing the setting of the scene entirely. That's something that I did as well when I was editing. There was one scene in particular that was kind of towards the end of the book where Eleanor, the main character, is talking to her love interest boyfriend character, Gilbert, and Gilbert is telling her some really sad news that's very pivotal to the plot. And it's supposed to be like a very emotional scene, but the way that I had initially written it was just not it at all. And so I tried changing the entire setting and scenario in which he's giving her this information, and it spruced up the scene. It added more relevance to it. And so I feel like if you find yourself being bored, spice up your locations in which things are happening. Like, where are your characters? Are your characters always in the same place? Are they having new interactions and experiences in new places? Like, change up your settings, and I feel like that helps a lot with making your plot a little bit more interesting. So that's kind of all the tips that I have for you today. Recap, my tips today were: take a break from your manuscript after you've written the initial thing. Take a break, give yourself some space and time to clear your brain, because you need that. Tip number 2 is to write down the problems that you have with your manuscript and brainstorm solutions. Make lists of ways that you can solve those problems, which you will then incorporate later on. Tip number 3 is to go through your entire manuscript, reading it out loud to catch any mistakes and to make sure that your wording is flowing nicely. And tip number 4 is to then incorporate the solutions that you wrote down in tip number 2 by thinking about what your scenes are lacking and adding whatever it is that's lacking. Whether that's more witty dialogue, more character development, more interesting settings for your scenes to take place in, whatever that is, that's kind of what you're doing in editing. So thank you guys so much for watching this video today. I hope some of you found it helpful. If you did, please go ahead and hit that like, and if you feel like it, you can hit the subscribe button as well to be notified for my future videos. But until then, I will see you all in the next video. Bye.